Bienvenue, Falcha, welcome, and good afternoon. My name is Nicole Cameron, and I'm very fortunate to live in Unama'ki, land of fog, or as more commonly known, Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. I'm the Director of Operations and Special Projects at the Community Sector Council of Nova Scotia, and on behalf of ourselves and our partners, we want to welcome you to our first session in Series 3 of the Decolonization Learning Journey. This makes today's talk the 10th in the series of 12 educational webinars this year, and we're very glad to have you on this important journey. I'd like to acknowledge that while we are not gathered in person, we are still connecting with you virtually from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what would be an ongoing relationship between nations. We're delighted and very honored to have Hereditary Chief of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, Chief Stephen Augustine. Stephen, I believe this is your third, possibly even your fourth session with us. So, Alan, thank you. Welcome back, and thank you for your continued support and commitment to this great journey. We're also very honored to have Chief Andrea Paul from Pictou Landing First Nation. So, Upchilidu, warm welcome to you both. Mary Beth will more formally introduce you in a few moments. So I'd like to just cover a couple of housekeeping notes as more people gather on the call, and then I will turn it over to the rest of our hosting team. So as many of you know, our beloved elder Jane Meader has been with us on this journey. Welcome, Jane, and as well as our brilliant moderator, Mary Beth Doucette, who is assistant professor, one finger. Mary Beth is assistant professor and Purdy Crawford chair at the Shannon School of Business at Cape Breton University. So before we get started, I'd like to just go over a couple housekeeping items so you know how to more fully participate in today's event. So when you join the webinar, you'd likely notice that you're in listen-only mode. We have about 300 people registered in today's call, so we just like to keep the kind of the background chatter a little bit softer. But that said, you do have the opportunity to post questions in the question box. So simply on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll notice a drop-down under questions, and you can pop your questions there. We will try to get to all of them, but knowing that there's a great deal of interest in today's talk, we may not be able to get to everything. Lastly, we are recording today's presentation, and you will receive a copy of the recording, hopefully by tomorrow. And as always, we always post a resource document on our website, and we'll send a link along with the email that we'll send out tomorrow, so you have access to that. So that said, I'd now like to call on Elder Jane Meader to more formally open our circle today and offer an opening prayer.
Isok Niskamijina, Gugumijina, Asta Highway, Wiwaloleg, Uchidulangagweg, a Haidamoleg at Koiminen Gisko, Siawia Bohan Winen, Keswaskum Kutchik, a Haganama Hatchik, Aktigigoski Jinog. Iginamuyeg and Sidawahan, Exalsudi, Amogiganodi, Flamandan Desia, Kissisiawatisnet, Akisilwatisnet, on the winter modahan, a Habohan Muyeg, Wejidunen, Mantahodi, Ulao Sithamog, a Bohan Muyeg, Mwanda Swalanen, Samaganis, Dan Eldabni, Dan Wajidajig, Matending, Sego Sithamog, Ahola Amog, Yes. Evigadimidich, the Mitkino. Creator, grandfathers, grandmothers, and ancestors, we are grateful to you for this day, and we ask that you be with us. We also humbly ask for your assistance as we address and teach other people. Grant wisdom, love, and strength to all of us so that we can continue to do our work together in a careful and proper manner in promoting Indigenous matters or concerns, especially when advancing and fostering peace on our Mother, the Earth. Help us also to not forget the sacrifices of those warriors who fought here and overseas to protect our homelands and our people. Amsidnogama, all my relations.
Well, thank you, Jane. I just want to acknowledge as well and provide an additional thanks to the province of Nova Scotia for funding support and to help make this education series possible, and to our partners at Unama'ki College at Cape Breton University. As I'm sure you can appreciate, the task of determining the curriculum for this 12-part webinar series was a difficult one, as there's so much to learn and so much to unlearn. And of course, the more we learn, the more we realize that there's even more to learn. So we sincerely appreciate you being on this journey with us and hope that you continue your learning by checking out the support resources on our website. That said, today's session builds on some of the history that we've learned earlier in this series through Stephen Augustine and through other generous elders and knowledge holders. Understanding that there are two forms of Indigenous governance, today is an important piece of this journey. In our webinar today, we'll discuss both Indigenous governance systems, their relationships and interactions, and as well as how nations are establishing new means of forming self-governance and self-determination. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Mary Beth, and to you, Jane, to add any more context that you'd like to provide for the webinar today, and to more formally introduce Stephen and Chief Andrea Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. So I don't have much to say getting started. I look forward to hearing from Stephen and Andrea soon, and I think I'll just give this time over to Jane to see if you have any thoughts that you'd like to get us up and running with. No? Okay, that's fine then, Jane. we'll have lots to say later, I'm sure. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce Chief Stephen Augustine and Chief Andrea Paul. And as Nicole had mentioned, Stephen has been with us multiple times on multiple occasions. And so rather than read his whole bio, I will just say that Stephen is a hereditary chief of the Magma Grand Council, and he is also the Associate Vice President of Indigenous Affairs and Unama'ki College at Cape Breton University. And he's had a long career in various and multiple roles across Canada and in various important positions. And today we're grateful that Stephen has agreed to join us to talk about and share some information about his role as a hereditary chief of the Magma Grand Council and some of the traditional and modern roles of the Magma Grand Council governance structure are today. So Stephen, before I hand it off to you, I'm also going to read Chief Andrea's bio, if that's okay. Chief Andrea Paul from Pictou Landing First Nation was born and raised in Pictou Landing First Nation, and she's lived there her whole life. Chief Paul graduated from St. FX in 2005 with an undergraduate degree and returned in 2008 for her Bachelor of Education. Chief Andrea was instrumental in opening a school in Pictou Landing First Nation in 1995, where she taught Mi'kmaq language classes and was also a counselor. She was elected as chief of Pictou Landing First Nation in 2011, and since then, part of her community leadership has been holding the Nova Scotia government to task over the pollution of the Aseg, also known as Boat Harbour, situation. So this local tidal estuary was once a beloved site of fishing and swimming, but has been transformed into one of Canada's most toxic waterways and a potential example of environmental racism. Chief Paul's leadership is based on carrying the voices of her community forward and towards prosperity. So with that, Stephen, I will hand it over to you for your whatever you want to share with us today.
Oh, I'll put my mic on. I just want to say that I know Chief Andrea, and I have lots of respect for her and admire her leadership for her community. When I was 6, 7, 8 years old, my mother went to visit her sister, Dora Thomas, who was married to Mike Thomas, and we were at the home of Ginny Joe, and we used to go down swimming down at Boat Harbor digging clams, and we'd end up going to Mulligomich for the mission in a boat for a long ride. It was scary when I was little at the time, because there were high waves in the water when we were going there in a motorboat. Anyway, so all that to say, I've been there. I've been Ozeg. I've been to your Ozeg, and it was a very beautiful place for us kids to play around and dig clams and go to the shore, make a fire, and boil the clams. Anyway, well, Ollie. I just want to say that I'm a hereditary chief on the Magma Grand Council, and it's not of the Grand Council because our last hereditary chief was John Denny, who passed away in 1918, I believe, or 1919. And we started with electing our Grand Chiefs, Gabriel Silaboy, after that. And after Gabriel Silaboy, we had Donald Marshall Sr., and then we had Ben Silaboy, and now we have Norman Silaboy as our Grand Chief. So going back to trying to understand where all that comes from, I grew up listening to oral history from my great-grandparents, Isabel Augustine, who married Simon Joe Simon in Big Cove, Elsie Buktuk, they call it today. And she carried a lot of the stories from her father. His name was Noel Tom Augustine. That would have been my great-grandfather. But on my father's side, my father's father was Basil Tom Augustine, who was half brother to Noel Tom, my great-grandfather. On one side, he was my grandfather, and the other side was my great-great-grandfather. So they were like half brothers to each other. And their father's name was Tom Augustine, and Tom's father was Noel Augustine. That's why the Noel Tom name came. And then Noel's father's name was Peter Augustine. And then Peter's father's name was Michael Augustine. And in 1760, March 10, Michael Augustine signed a Treaty of Peace and Friendship in Halifax. That is why they call me hereditary chief. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that there are other families of descendants of some of the men that signed the treaties in the 1700s that are probably hereditary chiefs, but they haven't done their genealogy and things like that. And I just happen to be fortunate enough to have somebody else do my genealogy for me, and they brought out all those lineages for my sake. So in listening to the creation story, I heard, that there were 7 levels of creation: giver of life, grandfather, son, mother earth, and then in the east, Glooskap or Geluluskap, the first one who spoke to us, and then his grandmother Nugami, his nephew Nedawansam, and his mother Niganaganim Kuzisk. So they were altogether seven levels of creation, as well as 7 sacred directions: upward, within us, and below us, and so on. And in the creation story, after the creation of the mother, the eagle comes and tells Glooskap he and grandmother have to leave this area, Migamagi, and his mother and his nephew are going to look after the fire. And so from this fire, 7 sparks fly out, 7 women are created, and 7 sparks fly out, and 7 men are created. And together they form 7 families. And my great-grandparents told me that one of those families is the Magma people. And so at some point in time, everybody left the area of the Great Fire. They had to take sparks from the Great Fire, the original sparks that were made from the lightning bolts that caused Glooskap's creation. So everybody brings their sparks in a what they call in 2 clam shells or quahog shells, and using this birch fungus. We call it jigos in our language. It's you just put the spark to it, and it'll burn slowly. And our women were given the responsibility of carrying and looking after that chibukto, or the Great Spirit Fire. So after being where Glooskap and everybody was created, everybody left. We came out here to Chibanuk, meaning where the sun rises, Wabanagi. And in order not to forget the significance and the meaning of the 7 levels of creation, we divided our families into seven groups, 7 clans. And one of them, the places of the fire, we called it Mawiomi. It's where probably the oldest, the wisest, the one that had the biggest family, we call Sa'amau, or Mausa Aik. He's been here the longest time, and we reversed the word Sa'amau. And so that's who was kind of looking after this central fire, what we call this place as a Mawiomi. And Mau is like in a Mi'kmaq word for together. Wius is meat. Wiomi is like muskwi guam, is like a birch bark wigwam. And so Wiomi is like the oil or the grease that we share from the meat that is hanging in the wigwam, close to the fire and swinging around and round and round, and then it goes back the other way. And so as it's cooking, the grease from the meat will flow down, and we have a birch bark plate that collects this wiomi. And so the role of the chief, the grand chief, or Sa'amau, was to make sure that his family was living healthy and happy and safe, and that they had the food and the medicine and the clothing and the shelter, the tools of survival, and how to travel around on wigwams and toboggans and canoes, and then the ability to be able to negotiate for their survival by means of our ceremonies. Sweat lodge ceremony, we heat the rocks, and we have a dome-shaped shelter where we bring the rocks in, and usually the 7 representatives of the 7 families or clans sit around in a circle, and they call in 7 stones each round, and so that's what our sweat lodge ceremony is all about. But going back a little bit, that's to honor the grandmother and to honor our leaders. I mean, when we start the sweat lodge ceremony, we always offer the first prayers to the east, to the direction of our leaders, our chiefs. And then we talk around in a circle and so on. And then once we're done, we clap and we ask the door to be open, and we sing, and 7 more rocks are brought in, to honor the grandmothers. And the prayers go around in a circle until we're all sweating and hot and wishing to open the door. So the door opens, 7 more rocks, and this time we offer it to the young people in the direction of the west. And finally, the final round, 7 more rocks come in. So altogether, we got 28 rocks sitting inside the sweat lodge in the middle, and water is poured on them, and we sweat in the circle. And so the northern one is offered to our mothers. So the prayers are always sent out to our leaders, our knowledge keepers, the women, the grandmothers, the young people in the West for their vision, their strength. They are the backbone of our nation, and so we as adults have to behave in a certain way. So the little ones were watching us, so we leave an example of a way of life that they need to follow in order for them to survive and live. So the chief is actually responsible for making sure that his family has all of those necessities of life. It's like our social safety net. And so the Mawiomi is that concept to be able to provide all of those things. But the other role of the chief is to negotiate for our survival, to head and lead ceremonies like the sweat lodge ceremony, the pipe ceremony, the sweetgrass ceremony, the tobacco ceremony, tobacco offering and burning. I'm not going to go into detail with the Magma creation story. We'll be sitting here for the next 4 hours. But anyway, I'll just that to say that the role of the Grand Chief was to negotiate survival among his family. If somebody was not getting along up the river system with his cousin or brother or whatever, the chief would go there and intercede and say, well, you guys stop this. Maybe you should pick up your stuff and move to that other river system, 20 miles away, so you guys can stay away from each other's hair and whatever. So that's the chief's role. And the negotiation of survival is like we sing songs, we drum, we dance. And this is our way of saying thank you, Mother Earth, for giving us all the necessities of life. We burn tobacco, we burn sweetgrass, and each time we burn something and a flame goes up or a smoke goes up, and our elders teach us that our words are embedded in that smoke, and we're offering it to Giver of Life. We're offering it to Grandfather, Son. We're offering it to Mother Earth, to our leaders, to our young people, our grandmothers and our young people, and our mothers. So each time, and so the smudge ceremony, sweetgrass, whatever, sage and cedar, we burn, and then we offer the smoke in those 7 sacred directions. But also when we light the pipe, we fill the pipe 7 times. And the explanation is the grandmother comes from the rock in the ground, so the pipe stem bowl, the pipe bowl represents grandmother because it comes from stone, and the stem of the pipe comes from a tree because Glooskap's mother came as a leaf from the tree. So our ceremonies are kind of linked to our grandmother, our mother, and there's a very strong female element in the pipe ceremony, in the sweat lodge ceremony as well, because the lodge itself is considered to be anigom. Anip means the womb of our women, so it's the lodge of our Mother Earth. We crawl back in to recreate ourselves in a sweat lodge ceremony, and we crawl back out red and shiny and naked, crying, laughing, praying, and it's just like we're coming back out as children when they're first born. They're all red and shiny and crying, and so this is our way of recreating ourselves, and it's a really neat circle of existence. So all of that happened before European peoples arrive here, and this is how we survived. We had 7 of those Mawiomis, and then the Grand Chief had his own Mawiomi, the big fire itself, and he could probably settle anywhere in Mi'kma'ki whenever and however long he wanted to stay. and he moved around making sure his children are okay, and sometimes he brings his family with him to help him survive, and so we coexisted in all of Mi'kma'ki with the Grand Chief. So that was his role, to kind of oversee all his children, making sure they have everything they need. And then European peoples arrive, French people. Earlier than that, I mean, we have the Vikings, and then we have the Basque fishermen, whalers, people from Brittany, France, people from Normandy. We have Spanish people. We have Portuguese, and then we have the English, the British. So they all arrive here, they bring their wars and their differences here, and so they plant themselves upon our territory, and all of a sudden, those of us that are related, Algonquian-speaking Indigenous people, those are relatives over there, are now in so-called enemy territory. And after a while, our people start making friends with the English, and some people start making friends with the English, and some with the Spanish, Portuguese, Basque, whatever. But eventually, a bigger war starts to take place between the French and the English. And we're on the French side. We are intermarried with the French, especially our women intermarried with the French men, because they didn't bring women with them for close to 25, 30 years. And it's only in 1632 that Isaac de Razilly arrives with women and children and families, and they settle not at Port Royal, but way over on the other side in La Heve, on the Lunenburg side of Nova Scotia. They settle over there, but de Razilly dies after 4 years, and somebody else takes over, and they decide to move to Port Royal. And those Indigenous women that were intermarried with the French that were living around Port Royal, well, they were chased out of there. The French were very, like, they called them high society French. They were high-ranking military people or rich people that had lots of money. And they called them the bourgeoisie, the rich high society. They didn't want to mix their children with the Indigenous, half French kids. And so they pushed them, they told them, go down around Cape Sable area, around Clare and whatever. So everybody else got kicked out of there, and so a new French establishment settles at Port Royal. And so this is going on from about 1620s right up into 1650s, 60s. I mean, the British keep coming back and harassing the French. They keep attacking Port Royal, and every now and then there's an open war. But finally in 1710, the English kind of rout out the French. They beat the French. They defeated only Port Royal. I mean, and that was the French territory, New France, Nouvelle France in Acadia. And so the British take over, and Treaty of Utrecht happens in 1713. It was a treaty between the French and the English, and it's negotiated across the ocean on the other side. And they come back, and the French have lost. They give up to the British, but they're still living around us, among the Mi'kmaq people, everywhere in Cape Breton, mainland, in New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. I mean, we were everywhere, and we're still living friendly with the French. But then all kinds of battles start to take place. Louisbourg was built in the 1720s, and the French really settled there. And when they gave up in 1710, Cape Breton belonged to the French still. It was called Ile Royale, and the mainland was owned by the British. They tried to claim Prince Edward Island, which was called Ile Saint Jean, and then New Brunswick. So they tried to take over all those lands, but they had a hard time. Finally, by the 1750s, after a few treaties of peace and friendship, with the Mi'kmaq in Sugubunagarik in 1752, they decide, okay, well, that we have enough friends among the Mi'kmaq people, we're just going to ship everybody out, the French people. So they loaded up the boats with probably around 15,000 Acadian French-speaking people. And along with them went Mi'kmaq women that were intermarried with some of the Frenchmen. And they had children among them, and even some of their families went with them, like their brothers or their sisters. They were expelled along with the other French Acadians. So a lot of our people ended up being shipped away in boats and so on. And so after the French left, Nova Scotia becomes a real strong possession of the British. And so the English takes over, but the guys that settled here, I mean, they were having differences in United States, like in the New England state, New York and Boston, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. They were not getting along with one another, Rhode Island and Connecticut. And so some people liked the crown, liked the king, and some people didn't. So because they sweated and tried to earn their own living in America, they said we don't want to pay taxes to the king anymore. So there was a revolution in 1772, 76, and it was settled by 1780. And the United States declared their independence on July 18, 1776. And the Mi'kmaq went down there. They had entered into a treaty with the Americans on July 19, 1776. That's 2 weeks after they declared their independence. The Mi'kmaq entered in a treaty relationship with them. So that being said, they shipped out those English people that were loyal to the king. 18, 20, 40,000 of them were sent out from the New England states. They arrived here in Nova Scotia. And then when they arrived here, the Nova Scotian government told them, go settle over there in the other part of Nova Scotia, which was New Brunswick at the time. All of Acadia was called Nova Scotia. During the time of the peace and friendship treaties, there was no New Brunswick. And it was only after 1783 that New Brunswick came along, and two other treaties were signed in New Brunswick in 1779 and 1789, one in the Miramichi and one in the St. John River. So after that, the British colonials settled. They established the colony of Nova Scotia, the colonial government of New Brunswick, and eventually the colonial government of Prince Edward Island, Upper Canada and Lower Canada, which became Quebec and Ontario. So by the 1790s, all that was done. And from there till, so we were operating under a colonial system. In the early 1800s, the colonial governments of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they started creating Indian reserves for us, like 50,000 square miles, 60,000 square miles, 100,000 square miles of land was set aside for the Mi'kmaq Indians. But what happened was the settlers, the loyalists, started declaring their own territories and registering their own lands with each of those colonial governments, and they ended up taking up most of the lands that were set aside for the Indians. And then finally, Confederation came along in 1867, and the federal government, the Governor General of Canada, because he was the closest relation to the Crown, said, well, we'll take over the responsibility for Indians, because we entered into these treaties with them that there's still unfulfilled promises in the treaty, so we still have to look after the Indians. And in 1876, the Indian Act was created, and the Indian reserve system started in section 62, I think, of the old Indian Act of 1876. Section 82 established the elected Indian chiefs and the band council on Indian reserves. And just to kind of carry it over a little bit, us here in the Maritimes didn't really adopt the Indian Act election system until late. Some of us in the 1915, 16, and some of us as late as 1920s and 30s. But our people kept electing the hereditary chiefs, captains on the Grand Council. They kept electing them, and the government kept recognizing these people. They said, you can't be an elected chief. You're a hereditary chief. And the Indian Act, there was a section that said all life chiefs will no longer be recognized after such and such a date. And so the federal government failed to recognize the Grand Council any longer as an official entity or a traditional governance structure of the Indigenous peoples. But our people continuously kept electing the captains on the Grand Council to be their chiefs. And so one example is Captain John Jacob Sark from Prince Edward Island. He kept being nominated and elected as a chief, and the Indian agent, the superintendent, kept writing a letter telling him, no, we can't recognize you. And they disallowed him to be chief, and they called another election, and the people again nominated him and elected him. And finally, he was married to a white woman from the First World War. He brought her home from England. She was a nurse. And she stood up because she didn't fall under the Indian Act system, and she could consult a lawyer. And so they consulted a lawyer, and the lawyer wrote a letter saying, this is not right. You're not following the Indian Act properly. So anyway, all that to say that hereditary chiefs on the Grand Council continuously were elected in the reserve systems. Like in Big Cove, Jacob Augustine was elected as chief. John Augustine was elected as chief on the reserve, and they're descendants from the Michael Augustine that signed the treaties. And so this is where the hereditary chief system comes in. Some of us, we were trained early in our lives. I mean, like, if it wasn't for my great grandparents and my grandfather and my grandmother not like raising me as a traditional child, learning about the creation story and about the history of the Magma Grand Council, all of this would have been lost from me, I guess. And I must say that my formal university education allowed me to look more deeply into the documents, the treaties of peace and friendships that were held in the archives in Halifax. They were also held in provincial archives in New Brunswick and in Prince Edward Island. My grandmother was from Lennox Island. She was a Thomas. Her mother was a Bernard, and Paul. Her grandfather was a Paul. And she told us we were related to the Pauls and Bernards and Thomases in Lennox Island and in Pictou Landing as well. We have relatives all over the Maritimes, even as far as Bodolodec. There was a Thomas family there, and a Paul family, and a Bernard. And so, as well as in Wagmatcook, I run into people and we start talking about our relatives. And Catherine Bernard came from a family of 17 children. And then there's on my grandfather's side, John Thomas. There was Thomases all over the place in the Maritimes, in Nova Scotia and in Prince Edward Island. And we learned that some of them were escaped slaves black slaves, because they used to call some of my great uncles the Black Thomases, and so they tell us we we had a black ancestry, and a lot of times my grandmother would tell us don't talk bad about black people, don't make fun of them or anything. You come from them. And so anyway, that's all I wanted to say, was like the hereditary role was to look after our people. We didn't deal with money. And I think today, I mean, there has been a little bit of rock and rolling kind of conflict in terms of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council and the elected chief system. Some of the people that are on the Grand Council think we should take over the elected system, but I don't think we can handle all the money that's coming down from the government, and the chiefs are in such a good position to administer that money with band managers and financial accountability and all that stuff. And I don't see anything wrong with that system. And I think more than anything that we should be working together, because some of us that signed the treaties, we signed them at a time when the federal government didn't exist and the Indian Act system didn't exist. So it was up to the so-called Grand Council. I mean, the word itself was never written down, but our term for ourselves is Mauyomi and Chisa'amau, and the word Sa'amask is actually means the wife of the chief, the male chief.
Yeah.
But Sa'amawisk is what Andrea's title is in our language, because she is the chief, not the wife of a chief. So Sa'amask is a term that's always given to the wife of the chief. But Sa'amawisk is the appropriate term. Walalio, thank you. I think I'm
Thank you,
done.
Stephen. No, I think that's a great segue into introducing Chief Andrea and what her role is as an elected Indian Act chief. So, Andrea, why don't you tell us about your role and the system you work within?
Okay. Is my mic on?
Yep.
Oh, okay. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Mary Beth. And I just wanted to acknowledge Jane for the prayer to start us off in a good way. Thank you for that. I really found this very interesting, Stephen, so I do want to learn more from you. I was like writing my notes down and really want to learn, because it's something that we weren't taught in school. A lot of the stuff that we do today, we're starting to learn for me as an adult, right? And hopefully our children are learning this in our schools today, because it's unfortunate that we didn't get that kind of background growing up. And it's interesting because for us growing up, it was almost like you were shy to be a Mi'kmaq person going into a provincial school. So you kind of learned about, I always say there's a term for it, but I don't know what the term is, but it was said to me one day where when you're a Mi'kmaq person and you go to a provincial school, it's almost like you become two people. You become the person in the provincial school speaking English and following all the rules, and then when you come back to the community, you get to be who you really are. So I don't know what the term is, but I do know that there is such a term. So thank you for the introduction earlier. I did start St. FX actually, I'm going to say in, when did I start? 1989. And I was there for 3 years, and I quit after I think it was in 1992. Things were a bit rough. I dealt with a lot of racism, and so it was quite uncomfortable. So I just decided it was easier for me not to go back to school. And that's why there's that big gap of me not finishing my degree until 2005. And then going back in 2008 to get my BEd, because I always worked in education. So I'm really, I guess that's my passion, is education. And I became a teacher. Fortunately, I only taught a short while, but I always, I guess, did different kinds of teaching in my community with the people that I worked with. So I'm here to talk about Indian Act Chief and Counsel. So that's the only system that I would have known growing up. We always had our chief and our counsel. And it's funny, I was just saying to somebody the other day, like, you know, when I was a teenager, I never paid any attention to band politics. I probably wouldn't have even known who our chief and our counselors were. And, you know, it's just something we never really paid much attention to. So getting older, and I guess for me, because I always worked in the community, so I was immersed in different things with the band. So in the mid 2000s, I was a band counselor for 4 years, and I really enjoyed that time as a band counselor. But I did go back to school to get my teaching degree, so I focused more on that. And in 2011, I was elected as the chief. And in my community, we've been really lucky that we've had women in leadership for a number of years. So the chief before me was a lady. Her name was Eileen, or her name is Eileen. And the chief before her is Anne, or was Anne, is Anne. And so I guess I got to see that type of leadership in my adult life, which I'm very grateful for. So, so we all know that the Indian Act was enacted in 1876, and the goal of that was to have government control over the Indians, and they controlled most aspects of our lives. So, you know, they controlled the Indian status, land, resources, our wills, our education, our band administration. So we fall under that regime. And so chief and counsels, we have, under the Indian Act, we have a 2-year term. So we have elections every second year. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the election period looks like. So a minimum of 79 days before an election, an electoral officer will be given a list of all the electors in the community. So whoever is 18 and over, that list is given to the electoral officer, and they will send out the notices 30 days before a nomination meeting. It'll be, so before the nomination meeting, 30 days before that, the electoral officer will post in public places in the community that there's a nomination meeting coming up, and the date, the time, and the place for that. And so it gives people 30 days to kind of think about who they want to nominate, or maybe somebody might want to run for office, so they might talk to people and say, you know, I'm interested, can you nominate me, kind of thing. And you can decline. So if you've been nominated, you can actually decline. If you find out within that period of a nomination meeting, which is usually about 3 hours long, you can actually decline at that time, or you would have a 48-hour window to decline that nomination. So it's a very short window, and you have to decline with the electoral officer. So it's kind of tough, because if you're not around when the electoral officer comes, you miss that opportunity, and your name will still be on the ballot. And election is 42 days after the nomination has been held. So there's 42 days of, I guess, campaigning in the community. And there was a change where before you had to be just on reserve to vote, but now every member is eligible to vote in an election. So it is the responsibility of off reserve to provide their address to the band so that the electoral officer has that information to send out ballots and stuff. And you can also vote in person. So that is how that's done. So I don't know, I'm just going to talk about band membership because I don't know how many people are aware of what a band membership is. So each community is given a list of what, so it'd be like a list of all the people that have been registered into their band. And I'm not even sure exactly how many members we have in my community. So, but I do know it's over 600 and under 700. And there, so in order to, so your chief and council will be made up of one chief and one councillor per 100 members. So in Pictou we have one chief, which is myself, and then 6 council members. I think the maximum level of council members, doesn't matter how big your community is, I do believe it's 12. Yes. So, so other communities, the bigger communities have 12 council members. And there is now also a new act that was passed, the First Nations Election Act, which I'm not going to talk about because we're not a part of that. There are some communities that have opted into that, and it is a 4-year process, and it is different. There are some differences from the Indian Act election. We're still under the 2-year Indian Act, the 2-year Indian Act election, that's what we use here. And I guess for me, I wanted to talk a little bit about roles and responsibility of chiefs and councils. So like I mentioned before, so I don't know if I finished talking about membership. So for you to be a member of a community, you're either born into the membership. So for me, my parents were members of Pictou and First Nation, and their parents were members of this community. You can also, I think back in the day, they used to, if you married somebody from another band, I think for women, then your membership transferred over. That's not the case anymore. And it also used to be when children were born. So I have 2 children, their membership would fall under my membership, which if I was married to my husband, I would have gotten his number, and then my children would have fallen under that number. And when I say number, it's a 10-digit identifier, Indian status identifier. And so the first 3 numbers will identify what community you're from, and then you have your membership number, and then your last numbers are your placement numbers. So it would be like, I'm just going to say 0123 would be your community, and then right there. So his identifier of what community he's from is the 0030, and then his band number is 337, and then the 01 is his placement in that family. So that's changed now. So children now, when they're born, they do receive their own status number. They don't fall under that regime anymore that they used to. So my children, me and my husband never got married, or the children's father, we never got married. So I kept my number, but the children went under him. So they would be 02 and then 03. So that's even transformed over the years. And I don't know if this is really complicated, but this is who we are as First Nations people in Canada. We're identified. That number is unique to us. So nobody else in Canada is going to have my number, or nobody else in Canada is going to have Stephen's number. So so that's that membership piece that I was talking about. People can also transfer bands, depends on what structures they have in each community. So for some communities, you actually have to be voted in by the membership In Pictou Landon, Chief and Counsel would accept the members depending on the situation. So maybe they had been adopted out, or maybe they were marrying into the community or whatnot. So they would, if they applied to Chief and Counsel to say, you know, I want to be a member of Pictou Landon, so they would have to be released from whatever community they came from, and then we would accept them, and all the paperwork would be done, and they would then become members under our membership. So there's different ways that bands do that. So like I said, some vote them in, some chief and counselors just take them, and I'm not really sure of what other systems there are. So now chief and counsel. So chief and counsels are in very unique situations. So we're accountable to, I guess, back in the day would have been Indian Affairs or Indigenous, I don't know what they used to be called, but now they're called Indigenous Services Canada. So because of the way our funding dollars flow and for the programs and services that we deliver, we have a responsibility, just like any, you know, any municipality or any organization that receives dollars from the government. So you're responsible for those, you have to report on it, it has to be spent the way that the money is intended. But we're also responsible, of course, to our membership, to the people in our community. So what I always didn't like about the whole system was it was a very top-down approach, and this was the issue that I really struggled with when I first became elected in as chief, was that whole top-down approach, and this is the, you know, the funding that you're going to receive, and this is how it's going to be spent. And so they limit and they kind of dictate, I guess, how you're going to use those funding dollars. And it didn't matter what our needs were, or, you know, what we felt how that funding should be used as. So there's some programs that are flexible, but there's some that aren't flexible. They're very, very rigid. And I'm going to use the social program as an example. It's a very outdated program. And it's discriminatory in terms of, if you're off reserve, we can't provide you services, even though you're a member of our community. And that's always been a, you know, it's a very, for me, it's been a very contentious issue. It's complicated, and our funding dollars, there's some things that you know, you would be funded for based on your membership, and then there's things that you're funded on based on who actually lives on reserve. And for education, our funding is based on who's on the nominal roll. So you actually have to be ordinarily resident on reserve in order for us to receive education dollars for you. So if you're a elementary or secondary student, but you don't live on reserve, we're not able to provide those supports because we don't receive those dollars. So there's those types of inequities, I guess, that we have grown into that make it really challenging for us. And we would get you know, the community would get upset with the leadership on these existing policies that we had nothing to do with. So that's a bit about the governance system being imposed on us. So over the years, the last little while, you've noticed that there's been some changes as to how the governance structure works. And it got divided into two divisions. So we have Indigenous Services Canada, and we have, it's called Crown, I have my notes. So Crown and Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. So there's now two streams that we are responsible to, or they're responsible to us. So there's been a shift over the years on how we see this relationship. So when I talked about this very top-down approach, there's been, you know, chief and counselors well before my time that have been fighting this and fighting this and fighting this and saying this system doesn't work for us. You're keeping us from growing because of the way, you know, that this whole process, this whole relationship looked like. So CERNA, they call it, it recognizes our rights, respect, cooperation, and to develop the partnerships. So that's one piece of the governmental structure that we work with. And then there's Indigenous Services Canada. And so their mandate is to support and empower Indigenous peoples to independently deliver services and address the socioeconomic conditions in their communities. So that's a change from even when I first got elected in as chief in 2011. There's been so many different changes that have been happening, and different ways of looking at things. And, you know, there's still a lot of things that we need to, of course, work on, but at least the conversations are happening, and they're happening at a very technical, high level. And so I'll kind of go through what that would look like for chiefs and councils. So as Stephen mentioned, the Indian Act displaced our traditional political system. It took that away. So that's why when he was speaking, it was really interesting for me to learn more about that, because it's not a system that we grew into. We often hear about the Grand Council, and people will often ask, oh, what's their role? And how do they fit into all this? And these are actually conversations that we're still having today, is how do we bring them together so that we're all working together? Because at the end of the day, we're all striving for the same things. We all want the same things. So which is, we need to figure out how to mesh them so that they work cohesively. So and so when they did that, there was when they displaced our traditional political systems, there was no consideration of our needs and our values in our communities. And I've talked quite a bit about that. So as chief and council, we have a fiduciary responsibility. So we're responsible for all the band's finances. And so when you become chief, there's no job description that tells you this is what you have to do when you're the chief. So when I got elected in, there was nothing. There was just like, oh my God, I'm the chief now. And so it was like, what do I do, right? I knew what my role was as a counselor because I'd done that before, but there was no job description for that. And, you know, I got to work with Chief Anne Francis Muse, and so that gave me a little bit of experience of being with the chief. So when you're elected in, you know, you have your own ideas and your own reasons why you want to run for office. You have to prepare yourself, because you know that you're going to be walking into something that's not going to be an easy job. It's a rewarding job, but it's not an easy job at all. And I didn't realize all that was involved in being a chief. So there is a lot to be, there's a lot to consider. So you're responsible for your community, you're responsible for the finances, you're responsible for your programs, your staff. So you basically are managing a whole system, and you have to learn very quickly how these systems work. So we look after a number of programs and services in our community. And so we look after health, we look after education, we look after social, housing, capital and infrastructure. And under that would be your water and sewer, your roads. You've got your lands, you've got economic development, and then you've got education and training. You have your band support, and then you have your OSR, which is your own source revenue. So depending on your community, so for Pictou land, and then so we manage also our fisheries. That's an entity in itself, and we also have a small convenience gas station, Victoria Corner Market. So that's part of our OSR, and in there we have to manage the gas, the grocery, and the cigarettes, right? And then we also have gaming, which is something new in our community. We've only been operating our gaming for the last couple of years. Gaming agreements were signed years ago, but PLFN always opted not to get into the gaming. The opportunity was there, but it was seen as being socially responsible. So being socially responsible, though, didn't bring any revenue into the band. And these were conversations I remember being in council in the mid-2000s and having the conversations with the government. And we knew that we had these VLTs that we could be using, but we're not. What can PLFN gain financially for not exercising this ability to bring in that finances through the machines? There really wasn't anything. So it just kind of sat there for a while, and the last few years it's something that we have initiated. And so that's, I guess, in a nutshell, when I look at the community. So we're also different. So when you look at your other elected representatives, so you have your MLAs, you have your MPs, you have your municipalities who have their mayors and their councillors. In our communities, it is a lot different because we're in communities where we grew up together. We all know each other. We're very comfortable with each other. So the relationship between us and our members would be different than a mayor and her constituents. Very different. It's not as it wouldn't be seen as as tight-knit of a relationship as we have here. So for me, I always prided myself on my accessibility. I'm a very accessible person. I always made sure that I'm very keen on social media, so people can get a hold of me whatever way they need. They can come to the door, or I have 2 cell phones that they can reach me at. I have social media platforms. So if they don't get a hold of me one way, they're going to get a hold of me another way. Trust me. So, and I like that because I am a busy person, as all chiefs and councils and everybody. Everybody's busy, right? So it's important that we create that space where people can reach you. And it's important that our community members can reach us. And I actually just had a post the other day that, you never stop learning. Sometimes we get so caught up in our work because we're so immersed in it that it takes somebody to remind us to slow down, to say, can you come? So the other day, one of the elders messaged me, and me and him just sat and chatted for like 3 hours. And just talked about everything. And then, it was nice to, and at the end of it, it was also a reminder for me to make sure that things are communicated better. And I'm like, yes, you're absolutely right. Things do need to get communicated better. We always have to do better. And so I appreciate when I get teach-ins all the time, and it reminds me, because like I said, we get really caught up in our work. And because as the chief, although these are programs that I'm responsible for in the community with my council, which is a lot, So there's always that dialogue between different staff members and those check-ins and where are we at with this and what's going on with that and have you met with this one and have you done that? It's like, so you always have to have that going on. But then as the chief, you also have separate responsibilities. And because you're also the representative for your band. And I take that very seriously. So making sure that, oh, I don't need those notes. So making sure that, oh, so before I get to that, I forgot to talk about our strategic planning. So as part of the community work that we do, we also do strategic planning and outlining the things that we need to get done. And that's really important because then if leadership happens to change, then there is a plan in place which has been developed between your leadership and your staff. And so that is really important when you're working on community initiatives, right? So that type of work, we talk about our short and our long-term goals. Everybody knows what strategic planning is. And one of the things that was really important for me when I was elected in as chief was to start annual general assemblies, because our staff were doing such great work, but they weren't celebrating it enough. And so the reason for having annual general assemblies was to showcase the work that each of our departments were doing, because in a run of a year you forget all the work that they've done. And so I always look forward to our AGAs because sometimes even I'll forget the work that was done. And so we've done those. We used to do them twice a year, but it was just too much work. So we now just do them once a year, and it gives an opportunity for our staff and for leadership to, one, of course, talk about the things that we achieved in the past year and maybe some goals that we're looking at for the new year, and also to talk about our finances and to be transparent and accountable to our people. And also to hear from our community members and for them to ask the questions and to, to hear what they have to say, because a lot of great ideas come from that. Oh, I have 5 minutes left. Okay, sorry. So the other piece of being the chief is you're also responsible to be the representative for the community. So there's different organizations that where we have to sit on as board of directors. And then we also carry portfolios. So for me, my portfolio is health and environment. And this work happens over and above the work that I would do in the community. So I lead the health file and I sit on different tables for that. And then for the environment file, I would sit on separate tables for that. And then you also represent not only in your provincial level, but in your regional level, and then you present at the national level. So this is work that happens over and above the work that you're currently doing as the chief. So it gets really busy. And then you're also responsible for organizations and sitting on those boards and working with the other chiefs and with those organizations and doing the same kind of work, the strategic planning, the finances, the, what is happening in each community. So, sorry, I don't know. So those, there was more I wanted to talk about, but in a nutshell, that's basically what it would look like. And I'll just wait for the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea.
You're welcome.
it's a lot to ask somebody to talk about in 30 minutes or less. And the systems are all very complicated. What I hear is being a couple of different themes. As Stephen said in his, when he was talking, he said that the Canadian governments refused to recognize the traditional governance systems of the hereditary system. And then Chief Andrea was explaining that the Canadian government dictates the Indian Act system, and it makes it very, very complicated to do anything. And so you're constantly navigating between what the federal government wants you to be doing, and that's just not right. Jane, I'm going to hand it over to you to see what thoughts are burning in your mind right now.
Nothing really, but I am very grateful to both Stephen and Andrea for their knowledge and for sharing with us. Andrea, actually, I because we grew up on reserve and were poor as kids, we ended up we didn't have summer cottages. My summer home was Pictou. My mom would take us there, and we spent a lot of time at the beach, and we used to call it Asamkaduk, right? Oh. I was saying, yeah, and we'd be there all the time. Because Andrea's great grandmother and my grandmother are sisters, so that's how we used to go there all the time. But you know, it was just very, very interesting, everything that you were saying, and about the one thing I kind of want to point out with the Indian Act, because I've been an electoral officer for both the Indian Act elections and the First Nations elections regulations and act, is that one is 2 years, one is 4 years. And like you said, you have to give you have to decline within several days. With the new one, the First Nations Elections Act, you have to accept the nomination within 3 days. If you don't accept it, then your name's not on the ballot. So, you know, little things like that have changed, and it's a shorter period from nomination to election, and it's a 4-year term now. So it's I know it can get confusing. But really, other than what they have to say, I really have nothing to add, except that I really appreciate all that they have shared and all the knowledge that they've also taught me a lot in just listening to them. That's it.
Great, thank you, Jane. So it is a lot, and I guess, Andrea, on that point, do you have any thoughts, or can you explain why the reasoning why Pictou Landing hasn't gone to a 4-year election code? Is there any specific reason, or?
We did have some community sessions on it, and Council just decided to stay with the regime that we have, the 2 years, and it's tough. You know, you just 2 years. I guess the way I look at it is 2 years. It keeps me going, and there's no stopping because it's such a short window. 4 years, you're able to plan more, but I might get too comfortable, I guess. So I do like the 2 year because it just, I don't stop, right? So I guess that's a good part about it. I don't get too comfortable.
And that's probably what your community members tell you as well. We don't want to go to 4 years. We don't want you to get too comfortable. Thank you for that. One of the questions is pretty simple, but is there any limit to the number of times you can run for chief in your community?
No, there's no limits. So just till they get sick of you.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, just kidding.
So I also wanted, there's a couple of questions that came in that I want to address, but before we talk about that. I thought Stephen or Andrea or Jane, you might want to talk about World War I, World War II. Stephen mentioned it briefly, and when he was talking about, you know, like people return from the war and they had war brides and things like that. Mi'kmaq people who returned didn't necessarily have the same rights, even though they volunteered to go to war. They couldn't be mandated to go by the federal government, but when they returned, they didn't have the same rights, or at least that's my understanding. Does anybody want to talk a little bit more about the Mi'kmaq participation in the wars? Stephen?
Somebody's going to have to. Hello, do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
Oh, okay, I thought I was mic'd off. There were a lot of Mi'kmaq that went off to the First World War, but by around 1920s and 30s, there were people that came back from the war that were fighting in the courts that they shouldn't lose their Indian status. And then my dad went off to the Second World War. He came back. He didn't lose his status. In fact, we ended up getting registered in Lennox Island, band number 2, and then in Big Cove, band number 4. We were registered in both communities. But a lot of the Mi'kmaq soldiers never lost their band membership or their status. But I noticed in Ontario, among the Mohawks and a lot of the tribes out west, some of the Indians they became enfranchised. I guess that's what they call it. They lost their status. But and it was successfully argued in court in New Brunswick that the Indians didn't have to go to war. They couldn't be drafted. But already hundreds of them had already been drafted, and they were off to Europe in the war, participating in the war when the court decided that they didn't have to sign it. So.
Thank you for that clarification. Does anybody else have any thoughts about Remembrance Day or Mi'kmaq veterans?
Well, one of the things I wanted to say, like Stephen said, that the Mi'kmaq or the Indigenous people couldn't be conscripted, right, or drafted, but many of them volunteered. They were real volunteers. Unfortunately, after going there and fighting for homeland and the people here and sacrificing, when they got back here, they ran into things like centralization, where their families had been moved to a community. Their children, some of them, their children had been taken to residential schools. Then they come home and they're fighting side by side with their non-Indigenous comrades, and you know they're together and they're like brothers, and then they come home and they can't celebrate with them. They can't go to the legions. They can't do anything. And then also, I think the other big thing with Mi'kmaq in particular is, like Stephen was talking, we signed that Watertown Treaty, and still a lot of our people also went to Vietnam and felt it was their duty to go to Vietnam, even though it wasn't a Canadian war, it was an American war. But we also had that relationship with the United States. So I think those are that we have to remember, those veterans that went to not just World War II, World War I and Korea, but also Vietnam. And now we have a lot of our own Indigenous people that also went to Afghanistan.
Thank you, Jane. And for me, I think it also speaks to that the way that Canadian policies have been designed to set up to get people to give up their citizenship. And that's something that both Andrea and Stephen were talking about. I'm looking through the questions here. So one of the questions was related to planning and self-government, and how do we reconcile traditional government with elected government, which I think you've both been talking about the two different models. Do you feel like there's starting to be a shift, I guess, in Canada and the way we are managing the traditional and the current and the future governance structures with both the Canadian government and amongst Magma governments?
I think we are moving closer together, the Grand Council and the elected chiefs. And I would just say that it's only a certain few members on the Grand Council that don't personally don't I think get along with certain chiefs or First Nations bands. I mean, they have an axe to grind for some reason. I mean, there's a kind of a isolated reason behind their thinking. But I think when I was like listening to Andrea speaking, and I had just spoken about the chief's role, about food, medicine, clothing, shelter, tools of survival, and negotiating for our survival. Well, that's exactly what Andrea is doing right now. And but I think what happened in between the traditional system and the elected system is like what Andrea said. It was like a top-down system. The government, the crown, took over the Indians. And it's not until the last 50 years, maybe a little bit longer, that elected chiefs started to take over the responsibility for the bands and the structure of the bands, because we had to deal through Indian agents. I remember when I started going to school off reserve, I had to go to an Indian agent to get permission of where I could go to school, and they didn't want me to stay on the reserve. They wanted me to board at somebody's house off the reserve. And but I think, you know, like the top-down system and, like Andrea said, control over us. I mean, I think the closer that the Grand Council and the elected chief system works closely together, I think the more that we can look at the issues of self-governance. And I never believed that the Grand Council could take over the Indian Act system. I just don't have the faith in our membership on the Grand Council to manage all that money that's comes to the First Nations communities. So we do need the elected chiefs and that system, but I think the Grand Council's role would be more like almost like a Senate, almost like a peer review process, you know, just to make sure everything's going well for our people, and that we sit together in comfort rather than alienating each other or throwing bad comments at one another. And I think it's really high time that we all kind of work together. And I think a lot of the elected chiefs feel the same way. I mean, I've been on council. I was in the band council in Big Cove in 1920. 1970, when I was 21 years old. I mean, I'm really old, 1920. I had been on council and I've run for chief, I mean, unsuccessfully, but, you know, I had dreams, but all that to say, I've always been concerned about, like Andrea, how our community is run. I've always been interested in women's role. I mean, they should be on the Grand Council. I mean, look at what Andrea's been doing, social work and education. I mean, women give birth to children, they raise them. and they never leave them. I mean, while the men are out running around and gambling and doing all kinds of things. I mean, but it's the women that are always careful of that child. Is it hungry? Is it learning? Does it have medicine? Has it got good shelter? So I think it's a high time that women begin to show their leadership. And I was happy for the vice president in the United States in achieving that big accomplishment for Black people as well as for women. Anyway, I think, you know, the whole thing I just mentioned, I mean, from all those things that the chiefs were looking after before, and then the federal government taking that responsibility away from the hereditary system. I mean, but they also realized that we can't survive without the land and the water, the fish, the plants, the birds, animals, and all that stuff. We need them as part of our cultural identity. So they took over that responsibility, but they put us on these little pieces of land called reserves. And for us not to go out, they brought all those services into us, I mean, into the reserve. Food, medicine, clothes, shelter, you name it, infrastructure now. Anyway, I think it's a shift, but I think the elected system right now is having a big role in trying to get more autonomy in terms of how we look after our people. And I think I would support that system of somehow help, including us, the Grand Council, and working together as partners. But I would never see us taking control of the money. No way. We'll be broke next week.
It's all still politics, right, Stephen?
Yeah.
Andrea, I don't know what thoughts you might have on that topic. One of the questions that came in just since Stephen mentioned the environment was around environmental racism. So I don't know if you have any thoughts you'd like to share on that and your role in governance.
Yeah, so so environmental racism, a huge topic for, of course, PLFN, but it's an issue all across the world, really, on how our Indigenous people are treated, with industry coming in and destroying the land or the water that surrounds them, and it's so devastating. And what happened here in Pictou Landon back in 1965 when the conversations were happening, and then in 1967 the mill coming in, and growing up, you know, that's what for me, I was born in 1971, so I grew up into the pollution. So when I hear Stephen and Jane talking about what their memories are, that those aren't the memories that I have. So growing up, you just learned about this, you know, this place of being polluted, but not really understanding the backstory to it. It's not something that was talked about a lot. Like I said, it's not something that they ever taught in school. It's just something that we knew. And growing up, we would see the conversations, and I guess when I was younger, I would never have paid any attention to it. When I was a teenager, I kind of did, but not really. It wasn't until I got older, really trying to understand the issue at hand. And it took me a long time before even accepting that this is environmental racism, right? Like, just to accept the fact that this is done to you on purpose because you're a group of Native people that live there. Do you know what I mean? Like, it was just to be able to internalize that and say, yeah, this is exactly what they did to us, because we're in a documentary back in 1985. It was done by Claude Vickery, and It was called The Deal. And in that video, Dr. Bates, who was the head of the Water Authority and making that decision, and he's asked a question about, well, what about the Indians that live there? And he basically is like, well, they don't live in the water. They live around the water, and so what, right? And that just is the most, it really tells you the story of why this was done to Pictou land and First Nation, and the devastation. I always say it's been a multi-layered, multi-generational issue. I equate it, and I've said it openly. I've said it publicly. I equate it to you know, what their plan was with the Indian Act, or what their plan was with residential school. They took something away from us that was so inherent in us and destroyed it. So when they did that, it destroyed our resource, it destroyed our culture, it destroyed our language, it destroyed everything that we knew to be true into something else. And so those teachings never got to be carried down. So, you know, the things that my parents would have learned from their parents and their aunts and uncles and grandparents, they stopped after 1967. So when I was born into it in 1971, the only thing I ever learned was you don't go there because it's polluted, right? So we didn't get to they didn't get to continue those teachings with us. So that's, for me, that's why I often say it was no different. Like, my dad went to residential school, and so I know, like, you know, a little bit about that, and so I have that impact of that industry creating that much damage. And it wasn't, I always say, it wasn't even just about the water, but it was about every species that lived in that water and survived off of that water. It was our plants, our medicines, but it was also who we were as Mi'kmaq people, the devastating impacts that had. And so, and then just to, and I shouldn't have even been so hard on myself to accept it as that. But I guess, you know, growing up, you don't want to think that somebody could treat somebody else that badly. And to know that, no, it was environmental racism. And so, you know, it's a tough one to wrap. You know, there's a lot of teachings that are happening around it, and I think that's the good part. And I commend all the work that's been happening, for sure, in our community with that project right now, because we're changing that legacy, and we're working towards bringing our teachings back that were taken away from us. And we're making sure that the government also has a responsibility in that. And that's a huge financial responsibility that they owe to PLFN in terms of providing those programs and services, so that we can bring those teachings back to our community, right? So I don't know if I answered the question, but.
I think you answered the question perfectly. I was really just thinking about how that whole legacy of the boat harbor influences your how you make sense of your role as an elected band council member.
Oh, well, for me, it definitely provided the opportunity for that nation-to-nation relationship, and really making sure that the voices are heard, right? I always took it, I got to sit around with a group of women in my community, the Native Women's, and we were working on a project on Boat Harbor. And so there's conversations that I got to sit around and hear. But growing up, I also had my other teachings that came with that, and excuse me, and the different opportunities of hearing our elders speak, or our you know, our friends speak about it, and I'm lucky that I can understand the Mi'kmaq language. I can still speak the Mi'kmaq language. So to be able to sit around a group of elders and hear them speak in the language, I'm very blessed. I feel very blessed that I can get, because they will always say things that are different. So if you say it in English, it doesn't have that same meaning as when they say it in their own Mi'kmaq language, and it's so powerful. And so I always say, when I come with the voices of every person in my community, because I've had the blessings of being able to be around different tables to hear that. And so you almost feel like a messenger, right? You bring those messages across because they don't get to sit at that table. So for me, it was always important that I reiterated those things that, you know, and bring that message to the government and for them to pay attention to that message. And I think at the end of the day, our relationship with the provincial government, it was, because there were different levels of our leadership and different levels of government, or different representatives of government, you know, there was always these breaks that were happening. And I think, you know, just Stephen McNeil, I have to lift him up because he was paying attention. And when he became elected in, he knew that this would be a big file for him, and it was a file that he was going to take seriously, and he did, right? His ministers took it seriously, and his departments took it seriously, and so having that level of consultation and conversation was I don't take for granted, because not a lot of I don't think a lot of communities get that opportunity. So I would, you know, I have to put a lot of emphasis on our premier for making that happen, right? Because he made it a priority level.
Thank you, Andrea. Jane, did
Andrea,
you have something?
I have a question, if you don't mind. I've been in Pictou land, and I don't go there as often as I should, I guess, or as I used to. But you know, that whole boat harbor, one of the things I always thought of, and is when you're talking about the pollution, but the pollution in the air. That stuff that the landing people have been breathing in. It seems as if Pictou has had more than its share of sicknesses, especially cancer, with a lot of my relatives passing there. And I know you had a lot of relatives passing from cancer, but I also I'm just remembering that, you know, past syllabi where that bridge is.
Yeah.
I remember being there as a child and playing around there, and that water was beautiful, and it was green, and it was this beautiful river that ran by. I almost cried when I went to see it one time, and it was brown, and it looked like molasses, and it was thick, and it had this brown film on it. But what I really want to ask about, though, is especially with this COVID-19, when things were happening and people could no longer be part of, I guess we're no longer polluting the earth as much as they had, or things were not, nature was coming back and Mother Nature was healing itself. Since the closing of that mill, have you seen changes like that in the landing? I'm because I was there recently, and one of my cousins was talking about how these little ducks are back along that river that hadn't been there. Are there other changes like that of the earth healing herself?
It is incredible how quickly she will heal herself. So the effluent stopped running actually mid-January. And then it went through a hibernation period. So it was, there was still liquid coming out of the pipe, but it wasn't pulp and paper effluent. So it was coming from the boiler and the runoff water. And so that ended in April. And people would even say, it just looks brighter outside. So even just to be outside, things looked better. It was nice that there was absolutely no smell, none. So usually when it's really foggy and so the air pressure is really dense, it's in your home so bad and it stinks like, oh, the house is just inside your home, it stinks, outside stinks. So none of that. It was nice, like somebody posted a picture and literally stood outside and took a picture of the fog and said, it feels good to be in the fog and there's no smell, because it would be so heavy, right? It would stick to you. And the beach has become a big focal point. People are constantly posting pictures, taking videos of the beach and the changes there. I'll go in every so often right into Boat Harbor and capture videos and images, because we have elders that can't go in there. So for me, it's always important to try and capture that. And plus it gets to, then I get to have it on my memories and things I can look back, you know, moving forward of how far we've come. So that's a nice thing about Facebook and memories. But so I was at the bridge one day and it did become a little bit septic because we had such a really, really dry summer and not enough rain. So it was becoming a little bit septic, and then we had a really nice good rainfall, and I went in there and there's so much fish. Like I have videos of it and pictures. There's like, I don't know what the big fish were, but I messaged environment to say there's fish, big fish in here. I don't know what they are, but you'll see them, right? And but there's so many tiny fish everywhere, and like I've never seen so many seagulls in that area. And I said the seagulls are there because there's so many little fish in there, and they're going in and they're eating, right? Never saw that before. And ducks and the geese and the birds. It's just, even when you go into Boat Harbor, even though it's not cleaned up yet, but it doesn't smell. When I walk in there, I'll tell you, all I see is such a bright future for the people in Pictou land, and especially the young people, the access that they're now going to have in terms of the amount of water and the amount of land base that they're now going to be able to use. And it as you can tell, it really excites me, right? I'll be older, and it just makes me feel really good to know that they're going to have so much more happening because this is done. And it makes me very excited for them. Yeah. So yeah, there's a huge difference.
You got me all excited now.
You should see me when I get down there. I'm just like, my phone is out, and oh yeah, I get too excited.
I see Nicole pop back up there, so I think we're coming on the end of our time. One of the last things that I just want to ask everybody, I guess, is a question came in early around the idea of leadership and consensus building. And it was kind of an open-ended question around, you know, like, do you have any thoughts or ideas around the practice of consensus building? And I'll tag on to that because Andrea, you've been talking about the relationship now with the provincial government and the premier. How do you feel about the collaboration and consensus initiative, like collaboration and coming to consensus with the provincial government and that process? Again, it's kind of an open-ended question of take it wherever you want, but do you have any thoughts on the idea of negotiation, tension, consensus building, etc.?
Well, I learned that through the process that I guess I'm good at some negotiations, and I always say I have the gift of the talking anyways, and being able to communicate. It is something that I recognize that I'm able to do, and we may not always come to a consensus, but we can come to a majority understanding, I guess is what I can say. And through this whole process, it's definitely been very, very challenging to stay focused, because you can get pulled into many different directions, and it's always important to remember what the community was saying and is saying, and to voice that. And so when you're having those sessions with the government, I guess not being intimidated is the big thing, because it is intimidating, right? It can be a little bit nerve-wracking, and through this whole process, what I learned was that the relationship had to be respectful on both ends. There had to be a forum for open communication, and to be open about the things that you need to say, but to also be able to hear back thoughts, and to give yourself time to reflect and come back to things. So the collaboration between, because we worked with both the provincial and federal government, I think there's been a lot of good learning happening for all of us, right? And I often say to the governments, this is a really good news story that we're all learning from, and that future governments can learn from, on what that relationship with First Nations could look like if given the opportunity to just listen and hear what we're saying, right? And hear what they're saying too, right? But that collaborative approach, I think, I'm not going to say that it was solely because, you know, I was chief and because of my counselors that we were able to do this. This was a process that was developed over time. And I always say, you know, we just walked into that process at the right time, because, you know, our leadership has worked on it for so long, and we've been, you know, they've been making this path, right? And then at the end, we were just able to bring it all together. So.
Hello.
Oh, Stephen's not going to get his last word in. Jane, what are your thoughts?
I just wanted to say something.
Go ahead. You walked away just when I was going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, I know. My phone rang and they told me my truck is ready. So I just wanted to say I want Andrea to be my chief. How do I sign up to your band? Get the council to vote me in. You're wonderful. You're beautiful, and you're a very very learned, very knowledgeable chief, Mi'kmaq chief and woman. I'm very proud of what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. But I also learned from you too, so we all learned from each other. Jane was my education leader, so I have a group here that I'm, you know, we all do it together. But thank you so much, Stephen.
I just kind of want to add to what Stephen was saying then. And you know, I like women like Andrea. We have, like now in the United States, there's Kamala Harris, and she's such a role model for women. And so are you for our young women. And that's what we've needed for a long time. We've needed the role models, we've needed the leadership with women, for women. And like Stephen said, you know, that's how we've survived all these years, that matrilineal society. And I remember an elder one time being in a meeting with an elder friend. He was from Alberta, and he was talking, and about 20 years ago or so, and he was talking. He said, if you don't have a woman on the committee, it's not worth a damn. It's not a good committee. He said you have to have at least one woman on that committee. He said who will bring the heart, the soul, and the nurturing. to the people. But thank you so much, Andrea. I think you're a wonderful lady, and I have a lot of respect for you.
Wow, thank you all so much. One of the things that I am continually in awe and grow increasingly more around my appreciation is how much love and respect and admiration there is for everyone here. And, you know, it's beautiful to witness and to model. So thank you for that. I also want to thank our very special guest today, Chief Andrea Paul, Hereditary Chief Stephen Augustine. I've learned an incredible amount today, and I think, as with many of our sessions, it really helps us to appreciate that phrase, we don't know what we don't know. So I look forward to taking a deeper dive to deepen my understanding of both governance systems, as well as understanding more about the various examples of environmental racism in Mi'kma'ki. Andrea, thank you so much for sharing the great news of what you're seeing in your community and how Mother Earth is healing herself. She knows exactly how to bring herself back into balance. And we see it all the time, how much easier it is for her to do that if we support and respect her. And I just want to say too how much you just lit up when you were talking about the changes that you're seeing in your community, and particularly of the hope that you talked about for a bright future for the younger generation in your community. So thank you for this incredible reminder. Thank you too to Mary Beth and to Elder Jane Meader. You continually bring a world of wisdom to these conversations. And as an organization and as a collaborative team working on the decolonization learning journey, we're honored and very grateful to continue to deepen our relationships with you. Earlier in the talk today, both Jane and Stephen talked about Indigenous veterans and the incredibly unfair treatment they faced upon their return from war. I want to share in a follow-up email an article. It's entitled Indigenous Veterans, Equals on the Battlefield, but Not at Home. So as you remember our veterans tomorrow on Remembrance Day, I invite you to hold an extra awareness and an extra honoring of our Indigenous veterans. So as we begin to wind down our time together today, just a brief reminder that we have 2 webinars left in this series. The next one is next Tuesday, November 17th, where we'll be discussing culturally relevant education and self-determination. And we'll wrap up the series on Tuesday, December the 8th, with a discussion on language and culture. And just another brief reminder to complete the survey that you'll receive in your inbox as we close out our webinar today. So thank you again to our partners on this great journey, and to each of you, the hundreds of participants who week to week, you keep tuning in and learning with us on this journey. With an open heart, with open minds, and an open will to learn to act wisely and in right relationship with our Indigenous sisters and brothers. Wilaliok, merci beaucoup. And I'm still learning a bit of Gaelic, so tough believe. Maybe someone can correct me on that. And thank you. So back to you, Mary Beth, and to Jane for final words. Thank you. So Jane, I'm not sure if Mary Beth came off here, but as always, we'd love to give you the final word to close us out and send us on our way.
Okay, I'll just offer a prayer. And Iso Niskamijina, Ugmijina, Asahawegi, Mualulek, Jidulana, Awalali, Dandelia Bohon. Ahida Mulexia, which way win Isco. Asia, which way win Me Walono, Atawani Yelmidaji, Inaha Panu Wigwa. Amidadi winen Sanohan, Nadliach, Umsignogma. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wilaliok.
Thank you.